welcome and thank you everyone for coming to Canopy of Life. This is our Tree Festival Symposium today. For those who weren't here earlier, my name's David Roberts. I'm the Environment Manager at Willoughby Council, and it is Happy World Environment Day today, and we're eager to shine a spotlight on something that's truly remarkable and abundant around us, but not always appreciated. Trees, of course. And this lack of tree appreciation that we sometimes find is often seen on private land. Which brings us to our next speaker, Paul Knox, who's no stranger to giving talks on trees for council. He was on a webinar last night, you may have joined that one, imparting his knowledge on street trees in our neighbourhoods with residents. Paul's experience and qualifications cover landscape architecture and horticulture. He has forged a successful career as a landscape designer for both state and local governments before moving into private practice. He's passionate about trees and how they can be part of your everyday living within your home environment. Please join me to welcome Paul Knox with Designing Your Home Amongst the Trees. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks everyone. I'm on the air, yes. I'm going to try something I haven't done in the previous talks, and that's talk from the lectern, so bear with me. I'm guessing that most of us here today are in the pro-tree area. So in my case, my job today is to talk about how to get the trees rather than why, but just let me warm up by running through some of the qualities that have been mentioned by previous speakers. Trees, of course, provide climate amelioration, windbreaks, they control the hydrology and the water that runs through our landscapes. They provide habitats for animals, and they enable us to live in gardens that are full of things that delight all the senses. I've talked about sorry, it's going funny. I'm not operating it. See, it's happened already. Yeah, they can delight all the senses, touch, these are all tree effects, the sound in the casuarinas, the scent of the backhousey or the myrtle tree down the bottom right-hand corner. I've thrown in a bunya pine for taste, but you have to be particularly courageous to taste the fruit of a bunya pine. They are delicious, I'm told, but you've got to climb up an incredibly spiky tree to get them. And of course, visual beauty is, I guess, closest to my heart with trees. Not everyone's going to be in favour of the one in the top right-hand corner, which is a garden in Brunswick Heads, where they've embraced the whole jungle aesthetic. But even in the other two cases where you see one tree affecting the appearance of a building, of a house, having a tremendously profound effect. I'm pretty concerned about the one down the bottom, actually, but I'll come to that later. And of course, people often talk about trees and views and so forth, but trees themselves can create the view, and this is the view of our humble abode in Roseville Chase, where the wonder of that view is all about trees that have been planted and the different light effects that run through them. It's even said that trees can improve or raise the value of a property. This is a famous tree integrated house by Richard Laplastrier, the Palm Garden House, and if you know his work, his houses are always highly sort of permeable, often involving ropes and things you can open the roof and so forth, and it's kind of the ultimate. That photo to the left in particular is the ultimate in the sort of indoor-outdoor experience of a house. So there are issues about trees and the values of property. I think I'd always assumed that trees would add value and trees in a suburban setting would add value. Sometimes that view's challenged a bit around the North Shore now, where I'm told by our local real estate agent that people like to live in these suburbs because the blocks are a bit bigger and you've got access to certain schools. So, we've got to keep promoting trees as is happening here. And so my job, as I said, is to talk about how, not why. But we face some challenges as we move forward. Houses are getting bigger, blocks are getting smaller. Multiple dwelling housing is becoming more prominent. So if you look at the example in the top right-hand corner, it's a duplex, so you get two driveways, you get two pars, you get two places to store the bins, all these things tending to mitigate against trees, at least trees of size and character, because they're simply getting pinched for room. And when you compare contemporary. You know, these photographs taken in the last week or two, with what happened maybe 20 years ago in the one at the bottom. You can see that the opportunities the results seem to be diminishing even from a fairly low starting point of the picture down below. So there's a challenge ahead for all of us. And the other thing that's happening now too, increasingly, is this sort of thing. We're increasingly seeing blocks totally raised and then excavated to the boundary, so you can have the 4-car basement garage. And it's not uncommon. Certainly the total raising is becoming more apparent as I look around the suburbs where I live, which is in Roseville Chase, just out of Willoughby Council area. And yes, and it's the same block a couple of months apart, so everything comes down and then they go down even further. So we've got to get more determined to preserve the tree canopy and cleverer about how we do it. So, as in most things, you would start with a properly considered planning phase. I spoke to an arborist in preparing this talk, as well as the real estate agent, and his observation and complaint was that people often want to build a beautiful house. Maybe there's a tree on the site that they are particularly fond of, and they then progress the design with the architect, and eventually time comes for a council approval and the arborist is brought in and he sees a problem. You know, the tree can't survive where the architect is gone. So maybe there's a case for talking to your arborist or your landscape architect before you get too far with imagining the perfect house on your block, if you're wanting to retain a tree that's already there. And arborists will generally a starting point for them is this standard, the Australian Standard on the Protection of Trees on Development Sites. It's a long document. I won't go into detail, but perhaps the most important thing that comes out of this document is the concept of the tree protection zone. And the tree protection zone is defined by, you take the diameter of the tree at breast height, which is about 1.4 metres, multiply it by 12, and that gives you the radius of a circle centred on the tree, which is considered to be what the tree needs for a healthy, prosperous life. And it's actually a pretty big number when you think of the constraints on a lot of building sites. So if you've got a tree that's 30 centimetres at 1.4, multiply by that by 12, 3.6, correct me if I'm wrong, and then that's a radius, so you've got a 7.2 metre circle taken out of where you should not include any of your building activities. And I mean, it's pretty big, and a lot of the requirements of trees are like this. They're bigger than we like to think, and we kind of keep imagining we can get away with certain things. The standard will allow a 10% incursion without sort of further investigation to run a pipe through or maybe nip a bit out of the circle. But then beyond that, you're meant to have further investigations and radar scans of tree roots and so forth. You know, it often doesn't happen. But to get this on a site, I talked with David earlier about the compliance to these things. We'll see that compliance is definitely a big issue. The other way of thinking about a tree protection zone is the one that's illustrated very clearly in the Chatswood police station, Angofra, and that's the drip line concept. So you take where the rain would fall off the edges of the canopy onto the ground, and that gives you a circle similar to the one I've been describing with the TPZ. And this is an excellent example of how the building has responded to the requirement of that very, very important tree. And here you see a couple of responses, if you like, to protecting a tree on site. The one up top, it would seem that the people have the best of intentions and they're enthusiastic about the tree. They've sited the fence back, and I haven't looked at it in detail on site, but I'm hoping that there hasn't been any build-up around the tree's trunks with those sandstone blocks and so forth. The one below is the one tree photograph I showed you a couple of slides back, and this is what the tree protection zone looks like there. So it ain't 12 metres diameter, that's for sure, and they've even taken the opportunity to locate the dunny and random building materials, and no care being taken at all. Sometimes the arborist, if you are going to disturb a tree's space, will require irrigation and mulching and so on. It's not happening there. And you can see if you look into the cutting tree roots just being cut off ruthlessly. So compliance, is a big issue in these things. The other reason I think it's good to consult someone who knows a bit about trees is that not all trees are the same. In terms of their own robustness and in terms of the risks, if you like, inverted commas, that they pose. I've been told by countless engineers over my career that I must never plant a fig tree near any structure, pavement or anything at all. And the one up top is the Ficus hillii in the playground of St Thomas's on High Street. And yeah, it's a big tree and it does looks a bit dangerous even to me. But the one at the bottom in front of the barracks there, you're seeing a couple of fig trees, different species, but still figs. They're well into their first century and they're cheek by jowl with a wall that's well into its second century by the look of it, and everyone seems to be getting on fine there. So there are these differences within species and differences within site conditions that can take a bit of technical nous to work your way through when you're planning the house. The one on the left, it's probably not a great tree for that spot. In the 60s and 70s, people of about my age started to discover the delights of the inner west and at the same time discovered the delights of native plants, amongst other things, I suppose. And unfortunately, these two things conflated, and you get a lot around Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst and Darlington, and this is Marrickville, I think, where people have enthusiastically stuck a 100-metre high tree in the tiny front garden of a terrace house. So, again, it's good to know a little bit about what you're planting before you actually plant it. And the one on the right, my entreaty there is to think about the neighbours as well. That's a row of the dreaded Leighton cypress running east-west. So the people, unfortunate enough to live to the south of it, get almost no sun in winter in their front yard. So planning. People often think that fire is an issue to not plant trees. If a building's in a fire-prone area, the Rural Fire Service and CSIRO have some really good online resources that you can look into when you're planning a fire defence for a property that's in one of these areas. And I'm not a fire expert, so given the tragic and disastrous results of fires in recent years, I don't want to pretend to know all about it. But what I do want to say to you is that trees aren't necessarily, fire is not necessarily an argument against trees. In some circumstances, trees can actually be part of a fire protection strategy. They can break the radiant heat coming from a fire. They can obviously reduce wind velocities. They can act as ember shields. So they'll trap embers coming towards a property. And a friend of mine who lives in Gordon, backing onto a bushland area in the disastrous fires of, was it 1920, had a fire coming towards her house, and she had a great big camphor laurel on the back fence. There were other issues involved in this too, but the camphor laurel took a beating from the fire. It actually trapped a massive amount of embers. It reduced the radiant heat coming onto their house, and the house was saved as a result. So, as I say, other mitigating things came into that, but my only point is that trees are not necessarily an argument against, fire is not necessarily an argument against planting trees. It's also the case that fire tends to travel, as I understand it, most quickly through the ground level, and so it'll pick up and burn all the debris and detritus on the ground. It does get into canopies, clearly, but and if you're thinking about trees in a fire-prone area, it's possibly wise too to think about smooth bark trees rather than hairy bark trees like stringy barks, which would act like a wick and take the fire up into the higher parts of the tree. So again, CSIRO and RFS, I found some really good material in their sites. Right. Views, of course, are worth a fortune, as we know from looking at any sort of real estate results. And people will have different views about this, but I certainly think even the greatest views can be enhanced by framing elements and trees. And there's not really ambidextrous. And of course, the one up top is a famous example of how framing a wonderful view into the Megalong Valley from Everglades garden in Lura can be given this extra dimension, another sort of magic given to it by somehow containing it and drawing you towards it. And of course, the one down below is the disgrace of Willowy Street in Castle Cove. You know, the news of this sort of desecration went around the world apparently, and that sort of brings shame on us all. But of course, never forgivable. And what's so good about water anyway? I think you can have good views without water. The microclimate of your land will be affected by trees. And I mean, this is an issue, I think, in the planting which really doesn't bear any sort of justification. Trees are the best things you can do to alter the microclimate of your site. And nature has given us the miracle of the deciduous tree, which will enable you to get winter sun and shade in the summer. I mean, what a great idea. You couldn't have come up with it. And this is a ginkgo in our backyard. Bright trees like ginkgos, and there are other deciduous trees do it as well. The triadica trees at the moment are going similarly brilliant. And this tree actually bounces light into the dark parts of the garden. That's just the sun coming through it. It looks like it's got a huge floodlight on it, but it doesn't. And it actually does do this. So they can affect the microclimate in all sorts of beneficial ways. Looking to the maintenance issues is important, of course. Now, sorry, something's happening here. Trees do come with costs. They drop leaves. It seems to come as a surprise to a lot of people. All trees drop leaves, and they do have to be cleaned up from time to time, but in my view, not immediately. This is the same ginkgo that was throwing the light into our backyard, and it's just such a joy at this time of year to see them on the ground, contrasting with the black asphalt. I'm always amazed by, excuse me, I've just got to do something here. You might have to help me, Bill. I'm not being able to turn over my slides. I'm always amazed at people who buy into areas that are clearly full of trees, seem to have a total phobia about leaves, and can't bear to see them lying on the ground for 1 second. Just need to... Having got the planning stuff all done, oops, sorry.
Did you skip one?
Okay, good. That should be right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Done. Okay. It's a beautiful thing to be close to trees, like in this fantastic house by Peter Stutchbury, where you could reach out and touch the trunks. But there are things to take into consideration. This sort of thing isn't always possible. And it applies to trees you might be planting as well. And in my career, theories about planting trees have changed. It used to be the case that you'd dig the biggest hole you could possibly stand and fill it up with lots of organic matter and everything would be fine. And that was found to be a faulty theory, because a soil mix in a tree hole that's full of organic matter is going to decrease in volume, which means the tree will sink. And almost all trees cannot tolerate a build-up of soil around their trunk. Just about universally that's true. So if the tree sinks, you're going to get that build-up around the trunk, and that's very bad and usually often fatal for the tree. It literally ring barks at the ground level. So it applies to new. So the more recent theory is more like this: the better hole for a tree is as wide as you can make it, but not too deep, because most of the tree activity occurs in the top 300 or 400 millimetres of the soil. So you make it wide and shallow, and compact it under the spot where you're going to place the tree, so it doesn't sink. And cultivate the sides so the roots can move laterally. So one is don't build up around the trunk. Two is when you're mulching, it applies to mulch as well, so keep the mulch down to the level that was existing in the pot. 3, hard under the root ball. 4, cultivate the sides. And 5 is bear in mind that shallow is better than deep. Now, there are ways around the issue of you wanting to have access into your garden if there's an existing tree on site not wanting to compromise its growing conditions. Elevated pavement does this very readily. So there are all sorts of ways you can build a path on a frame and just keep it up off the ground a little. And the one on the right is an example of this at the ANU in Canberra, where there's a very nice stand of urabi, blue gums as they call them in Canberra. And that path that you're looking at there is made of the stuff on the left, reinforced fibre, RFP, metal block. It's reinforced plastic anyway, and has all these holes in it. It's mostly void, really, so that all the water and air can get through to the ground, and the whole thing can just breathe as it did previously. And that's about that high off the ground, so it's very low. And the framing underneath is steel, so it's not timber that's going to rot, so you can afford to have it down really low like that. FRP, fibre reinforced plastic. If your needs are heavier, you can still do elevated pavements. This is an example in Ashfield where there were existing trees and an urban sort of setting. So heavier loads and more robust finishes were required. So you can see the extent of a very extensive steel frame. And this is looking at it on top when it's built. And you can see hard pavement and hard surfaces. And that's all elevated on a frame, and the trees live on underneath. There's another thing that comes up with it in terms of, making the tree conditions better, and that's permeable pavement. This is simply pavement through which the water can go through. And it's really a technique that's better applied to new plantings than existing, because if you look at the diagram up the top, you can see that you need to go down the best part of 1/2 metre to build a permeable pavement because of all the drainage layers. So obviously not a good idea around an existing tree, but a good thing to do when you're planting new trees in a large area of pavement. You'll see a lot of this around the place. Olympic Park uses it extensively around the station. So the cut down level, disposal pipes, a drainage layer, a filter layer, and then the pave is just laid in a flexible material like sand. And these ones are called Eco Trihex, which is one of the common brands. And this is also a permeable pavement and maybe more suited to the domestic setting. Slightly ragged example, I'm sorry, but this is the garden of a good friend of ours who's made paths out of jute mesh, just laid over a sand layer. And they last quite a few years, and they're absolutely incredibly beautiful, soft things to walk on, and perfectly serviceable as paths for a residential setting. You can also avoid disturbance to the tree's zone by using different footing technologies. The traditional thing was to dig a trench and fill it up with concrete, but this is a system, you can see it in sort of real size to the right. That little metal plate, which is about 30 centimetres square, simply sits on top of the ground. You barely have to move the leaves and sticks out of the way, and then short lengths of pipe are driven in on the four corners at slightly different angles. And you can sort of imagine, I think, it's incredibly hard to lift or lower that. So you get a very stable footing, and they can take quite substantial loads. And then you add a leg of the required length, and you've got the elevated pavement with totally minimal footings. This system is called Shorefoot. I'm not promoting them. There are others, but they were the ones that we used on the example I showed you at the ANU. As I was saying to someone earlier, one of the things that seems to creep into people's thinking about trees and discourages them from wanting to live with trees is the maintenance issues. Totally sort of paranoid about what's the tree going to do to the house, what's it going to do to the pipes and so forth. There are things you can do about it. Tree barriers, the root barrier in the top left-hand corner will direct the roots down as the tree expands. You can have linear versions of root barriers. And also, a lot of houses these days are built with very significant concrete elements. It might be just a slab on ground or even the walls, reinforced concrete walls of a basement. And really, most trees will encounter that sort of engineering and just chuck a left or a right and go somewhere else. They're not stupid. So often, just the way the house is built is going to be a significant a useful, workable barrier to tree root incursion causing problems. And of course, there's all sorts of things. Gutter guards to keep the leaves out of the gutter, pool coverings. You can get modern pipe work tends to be less susceptible to root incursion than the old terracotta pipes, but you can have pipe lining technologies and so forth. And you can do what a lot of people do and get someone else to do it. And if there's no opportunity to plant, you can plant over structure. This is a famous example in Sydney. It's the Reader's Digest building in Surrey Hills. No longer the Reader's Digest building, but it's still there. This is a building designed by John James, and the landscape you're looking at there was by the late Bruce Mackenzie, who just died fairly recently. And you can see in the diagram I'm trying to convey the idea that if the structure, you simply need to protect the concrete slab that's perhaps over a car park or another floor of habitation. You have a drainage layer, very much like the planting diagram I showed you, and then soil and mulch above. And you can manipulate the design and the placement of the elements in the garden so that you get heavier loads over structural elements. So you can see it's piled up over the column in that case, and that's where you can plant bigger trees. So it's a bit of a last resort. I mean, it's usually preferable to plant in the ground, and that would be our first preference, but roof gardens certainly have a place. And for new plantings, what species? This was asked of me to give you a list of plants. Of course, it's almost impossible to do because there's so many plants on the planet and so many variable conditions. So, but for argument's sake, if we assume that the space is fairly restricted, the climate is what we get in Willoughby, and there are some views out of the site that aren't all that great, here are some suggestions. And I've picked up ones that I've seen, around Willoughby, just that you might sort of see them as you travel around. The Waterhousea sweeper has been used extensively down High Street. If you see it out around where Harris Farm Markets is and so on. And these trees, after a few years in the ground, are looking fantastic. Really wonderful urban trees. So it's a pretty big tree ultimately, but a really willing grower. Banksia serrata have been planted quite a lot around the streets, and it's a tree that perhaps some people will find harder to like than others because it's a bit rough looking, but intriguing, and absolutely irresistible to black cockatoos, which again some people might find challenging, but I love the thought that there are black cockatoos in the streets. Tristaniopsis luscious down the bottom is a recent cultivar of what is a native plant of Sydney, the water gum, and this one's just a bit softer and more sort of containable, and again getting planted all over the place. And I've put in Eucalyptus hemostoma, the scribbly bark, as a small, wonderful, characterful tree of this area. As I say, there's millions of trees, and we shouldn't forget the deciduous trees that mostly come from colder places in the northern hemisphere, but Sydney has that sort of climate that you can have a huge range of trees, from the subtropical to these sort of North American things. So Triadica sebiferum used to be called Sapium sebiferum, and it colours brilliantly in Sydney. It's a pretty vigorous tree, but it's very, very happy to grow. The one on the bottom left is Nyssa sylvatica, which is called a tupelo, as in the Van Morrison song, and it's again a beautiful tree and a wonderful colour in Sydney. And they're native to wet areas and riverine areas, so you can plant them in wet spots. The ginkgo I've probably praised enough, but I don't see enough of them. I think there should be more ginkgos in the world. A fantastic tree. And the ornamental pears are very commonly used now, a very popular sort of nursery plant. And I mean, again, this is a highly Googleable sort of subject. What tree should I plant? But I'd only caution people against coming out with the lowest common denominator result. A lot of people will see trees and they'll think, well, I don't want one that drops a lot of leaves, and I don't want one that gets too big. And once you've got rid of all the characteristics you don't like, you're left with, something like that, a golden cane palm in the front. This was a habit of earlier generations of council engineers when they came up against street planting projects, and they'd think, well, I don't want too big, I don't want to get in the wires. It'd be nice if it had a flower, and you end up with a lot of very sort of hot, stultifying sort of suburban landscapes like this with a little tiny callistemon growing in the footpath. So, be careful of the lowest common denominator. Maybe be a little bit adventurous. Afterwards, I'm sorry, did I say? Yes, urban trees can and should be managed. And I'm looking at my wife here when I say this, because I'm a bit behind on a couple of the jobs around the place. But this is an extreme example, not in Australia. This is in the north of England, a famous garden, Levens Hall. I've just put it in to show you just what you can do to trees if you know what you're doing. But I mean, perhaps this is more the scenario that we need to address. You know, trees need to be managed, and David Martin was saying this, and I think even Karen reiterated it. That you can't just expect these trees to live happily and put up with all sorts of disturbance. They need regular inspection. And here we go. And again, I mean, I think too with the management of trees don't live forever. Some of them live a long time. Some of them maybe live 20 or 30 or 50 years. They can be removed and replaced if things get out of hand, you know. So I think we need to bear in mind that can be part of a strategy as well. So you might have a tree that you like and it's quite a nice mature tree, but it's going to cause you problems. Maybe in some circumstances you have to bite the bullet. These are suggestions from the RFS, I think, on the left there. And one of the problems that people have with trees is that branches will provide a conduit into the house, into the roof for ants, possums, rats. And again, it's easy enough to manage. Just make sure there are no overhanging branches, there are no little gaps in the roof. But again, it takes a bit of patience and persistence and regular observation. And cockatoos, well, my caption to that is you've just got to learn to love them. I mean, cockatoos are far smarter than humans. And this is Man Street in Chatswood, which is a street lined with Afrocarpus, a podocarp, a type of conifer, and it produces a great profusion of seeds once a year, and the cockatoos are right onto it, and they rip the branches off and have an absolute feast. The trees seem to tolerate it. Mulching around trees on a regular basis is good, and I think one of we're probably all pretty familiar with the benefits of mulch, but I think one of the greater benefits is that it keeps the warrior gardeners away a little bit. Trees are often harmed by incidental, idle maltreatment, from whippersnipper damage, which ringbarks them effectively. The non-removal of stakes. If you look carefully to the right, you'll see how that stake is starting to interfere with the bark of the tree, and it's a real tragedy when a tree's 10 years old and it's so fundamentally compromised that the bark's almost gone for the whole circumference, and it happens all the time. So that's an important thing to keep an eye on. Our youngest son in his university holidays had a job with a garden maintenance person, and the mantra there was this: trim, blow, mow, blow. That was the extent of the gardening theory that they applied to their task. So you'd go in, you'd crank up the two-stroke motors, trim the hedge, blow it onto the lawn, mow the lawn, and then blow whatever's left onto the neighbour's place. And there's generally, I think, one of the problems with trees and looking after them is that there's been a bit of a dumbing down over time. A loss of some of these gardening skills. I think it's exacerbated by the fact that gardens now are often the responsibility of property managers, so there's this big incentive to do things quickly. It's probably hard to make a buck out of it, so you try and get in and get out fast. And the result is incessant noise in the suburbs, but apart from that, simplified gardens. So if you look around, there's a hedge, there's maybe one tree, there's grass, perfectly mowed edges, because that's another thing you can do with a machine, and not much else. And so this sort of mitigates against the presence of large characterful trees. It's a genuine loss of skills. The solution to everything like that is education, but maybe we should insist that the gardeners have some sort of horticultural qualifications. Maybe you should give the gardener a detailed brief that you want him to do formative pruning on the trees and mulch once a year and so forth, rather than just come in and then off they go to the next one. So, thinking. So maybe with the challenges around trees on private property, we've got to put more emphasis on trees in public places. These are Shyness trees in Haberfield. making a beautiful street. And certainly we should pay greater attention to these things, I think, but we still need them on private properties, as everyone previously has said as well. Relying on the public ones is not going to be sufficient. I've got a couple of images to finish up, which hopefully will inspire people. This is, to me, the greatest example in the world of a single tree interacting with architecture. This is one of the homes of Geoffrey Bower, a now deceased but famous Sri Lankan architect. We were lucky enough to go there, and that tree at the front there is a frangipani. And Bower, apparently over decades, I think you can see a block under one of the branches, sort of propped this tree up and shaped it so to give him just the right effect. And you can see the pleasure of sitting in that dining area, looking out through those branches to the lagoon beyond. Yeah, just totally beautiful. And some other examples. I mean, the one in the top right-hand corner is the Le Plastrier house that was on the opening slide, called the Angofra house. One of the things, and it's perhaps illustrated even better in the one to the left, which is a Californian example from the 50s, a garden by Thomas Church, a famous landscape architect of that time, a garden in Sonoma. And just look at the fantastic effect of those live oaks coming through the deck. And trees not only give you all the beauty and so forth, they're making an outdoor space more useful. They can actually contribute to the utility of your land. It's not just a decoration. And the other one is back to our house in Roseville Chase, and it doesn't have the sort of glamour of these other ones, but again, the trees are creating the beautiful effect, enticing you into the garden, making it more useful. And I guess for me, the ultimate reason to live close to trees is that this equates with living close to nature. So black cockatoos eating the banksia, or a child sleeping supervised by a kookaburra. These are joys only achievable in the presence of trees. So thank you.